Okay, so last but not least with evolution, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about phylogenetic trees. Now, I'd like to point out that you are going to have a lot more slides on your notes than I have on here. In class, we would actually do an activity where I'd have you sort of think about constructing a phylogenetic tree as we're looking at the different parts, whether it's their ecological niche or their skeletal structure or their amino acid sequence. You are welcome to do that on your own time. I actually will not I'll ask a little bit about phylogenetic trees, but I don't go into too much like figuring out what's what. You need to sort of be able to read them, but you don't necessarily need to be able to construct them on a test for me. Okay, so phylogeny is the evolutionary history of a species or a group of species. Our evidence is fossil records, morphological homology, and then molecular homology. So, our classification, we have systemics. It's the classification of organisms and the determination of their evolutionary relationships. We talked previous about Linnaeus, which was the binomial species or the binomial system of classification, and then of course we have our hierarchical classification, which starts with domain. Okay, a phylogenetic tree is simply an illustration of different organisms' evolutionary relationships to one another. Okay, we have two forms. We have cladistics. This is classification and relationships are based on shared heritable traits. Traits are split into those that are new versus those that are found in original groups. Okay, so in this case, what we're doing is we're actually looking at this whole concept of a unicellular sporophyte versus a multicellular sporophyte in plants. Okay, so we look as, we have this common and then it derives differently as we go up through there. Let me turn off my laser pointer. Okay. And then we have molecular systemics, which compares nucleic acid or other molecules against one another. This is where your proteomics comes into this also. Because remember, keeping in mind that DNA changes don't necessarily lead to protein changes. They're not necessarily going to lead to phenotypic changes, but at the same time, it can actually help us see when certain mutations show up, even if it doesn't show that there's an not that it doesn't show, even if there isn't an amino acid change, it can still show the difference. Okay, so skeletons provide a lot of strong evidence that all vertebrates actually share a common ancestry. The skeletal evidence comes from species that are now living and also from species of organisms that have become extinct. Okay. Ichthyostega, these are what we call, not a gateway fossil, maybe a transition fossil. I'm sorry. While I'm talking, I'm Googling. It's a transitional species. Okay, it's a transitional species. These organisms are literally half fish, half amphibian. Okay, and therefore we look and we go, oh wow, this is a pretty major difference. Were we in class, I would show you a movie entitled What Darwin Never Knew. It's a really great one. Part of it is based on a book called Your Inner Fish, My Inner Fish, or Your Inner Fish. It's a really interesting look at the evolution from fins to limbs. The fact is, you can, if you go onto YouTube, you actually, last I knew, there was somebody had posted all of What Darwin Never Knew on YouTube, but it is like an hour and a half long, so just to forewarn you. But it's a really interesting one. Then you can also see some that are part reptilian and part mammalian. Okay, and these differences come in your jaw joint, the evidence of tooth, and then ribs that actually occur on the neck vertebrae versus not on the neck vertebrae. Okay, but then was also, there were other characteristics of it that were more mammalian. Okay, vestigial bones we talked about a little bit before. Shows a little bit more evidence. So, for example, snakes do have a pelvic girdle, and humans have a tailbone. So it's something that we no longer use, but it is something that is still in our body from, our body plan genes still create it. Whales have a vestigial femur and pelvis, which is an indication. And let's face it, you look at your marine mammals, whales, dolphins, porpoises, manatees. What on earth is there doing a creature that will drown, that lives in water literally all the time? Organisms that can only sleep half their brain at a time, otherwise they'll drown. Like, that to me is a pretty amazing concept if you think about it, which is evidence that they once walked on land. We talked homologous structures previously. Okay, we have again our happy little comparison of, we added horse to this one. Okay, that is sort of a comparison of our forelimb. Okay, which is further evidence that we are derived from a common ancestor. Okay, molecular biology. So we look at comparing DNA. In order to be able to do this, this really shook up a lot of things as molecular biology came out. I know I talked about it before, especially ornithology. Seemed to really shake up the bird world quite a bit when we began to look really at genetic relationships versus morphological relationships. So we share what 86% of our genes with mice, 25% with the nematode worm, 22 to 19% with the amoeba. E. coli is about 9%. Oh, I'm sorry, mustard plant is 19%. The amoeba is 22%. It sort of got futzed up here. Yeast is 30%. Fruit flies are 44%. Wow, there's a lot of commonalities when you really think about it. Okay. This is a puzzle posed earlier. Hemoglobin gene is widely distributed throughout living organisms. It really has not changed. The fact that that happens is evidence of a common ancestor. Okay, literally billions of years ago, not even millions of years ago. All vertebrates have genes that make hemoglobin. Like other genes, it mutates at a fairly constant rate, even if they are in different animal groups, and the rate of change can actually be used to estimate how long ago the divergence was. So from humans and monkeys, there's about 5 amino acid difference per every 100 codons in hemoglobin. So that's looking at about 30 million years ago. The bird mammalian is about 250 million years ago, way back to amphibian and fish, which is about 400 million years ago, which is pretty cool if you think about it. So there, you saw previous slides, which was then determine evolutionary relationships based on the similarities among the DNA and also the proteins. We've seen this one before. Okay, this is just human hemoglobin and how it differs among organisms, and where we think then you have that last common ancestor. You always got to love the lamprey. I know that's one of Mr. Jordan's favorite things. Two related species start with similar DNA, but mutation occurs making their own DNA different. Okay, so then we can align with a computer regions that do not change. The advent of IT technology and computing technology has really helped the whole genetic field over the years. This is a phylogenetic tree built based on DNA sequence data of the bear family. Okay, and you look that, even over here, your raccoon and lesser panda are much further off. They aren't even in the same within the same branch, but they do have a similar ancestor. Okay, the DNA actually suggests that hippos are the closest land relative to the whales, which is pretty cool if you think about it. And again, I guess that makes sense. Hippos can spend a lot of time underwater, although they don't live there all the time. I always thought it's cool that they don't swim, they just walk along the water. However, we've recently discovered a 47 million year old fossil that seems to potentially fit this link in between them. So the hippo, one of the big things here is the hippo has a distinctive ankle bone, and so does this proto whale. We call this the walking whale, and it was an organism that did have legs, but did spend the majority of its time in the water, based on what we can surmise, which is sort of cool. That is the end of that, and that is the end of all of your lectures on evolution.